Yharnam is a city that asks you to forget. It wraps itself in cobblestone and candlelight, in the smell of incense and old wood, in the distant toll of bells that have been ringing for so long that no one alive remembers why they started. It is, on the surface, a place of quiet devotion, a city of healers, a city of faith, a city that rose from the mud and the dark and the centuries and became something that people crossed entire continents to reach, because Yharnam had something no other place in the world could offer. It had the blood. That is where all of this begins, and that is where all of this ends. The blood is the city's founding myth, and its original sin, and its slow destruction, all at once, all wound together so tightly that by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was far too late to separate one strand from another. You cannot take the healing out of Yharnam and leave the rest standing. The healing is the architecture. The healing is the reason the cathedrals were built, and the workshops were established, and the hunters were given their cloaks and their weapons and their terrible purpose. Remove the blood and what remains is just a collection of cold stone buildings on a hill above a valley that the fog never quite leaves. But the blood is not what it was sold as. It never was. Walk down any street in Yharnam on the night of the hunt and you can see the price written in the architecture. The doors are barred from the inside. The windows are shuttered and nailed. Incense burns in the doorways. Not for devotion, not for ceremony, but because the incense keeps the beasts at a distance, or so the people inside believe. And belief is the only currency that still has value here. Behind those doors, families sit in silence, listening to the sounds outside. The howling, the gunshots, the wet impact of things colliding in the fog. And they wait for morning, the way people wait for morning in cities that have been under siege for so long that the siege has become the normal state of things. The children have never known a Yharnam without the hunt. They were born into a city that locks itself away once a month, or once a week, or every night now. The intervals have been shrinking, though no one in authority will say so publicly. They have grown up with the understanding that the darkness belongs to something else, that the streets after sundown are not theirs, that the sounds they hear through the shutters are the sounds of a necessary process being carried out by people who know what they are doing. No one has explained to them what the process actually is. No one has told them that the beasts they are hiding from were, not long ago, their neighbours. And tonight, across the next several hours, we are going to follow it. We are going to go back to the beginning, further back than most Bloodborne videos go. Back to the college at the edge of the Forbidden Woods and the men who thought they had found the answer to the oldest question, and we are going to trace it forward through every institution it built and every institution it destroyed, through every life it touched and every life it ended, all the way to the nightmare at the centre of everything, and the infant that has been crying there since before any of this began. This is not a comfortable story. Bloodborne's lore, when you follow it all the way down to its roots, is not a story of monsters and heroes. It is a story of systems, of institutions, of the gap between what powerful people tell themselves they are doing and what they are actually doing. Of the way a genuinely good idea, healing the sick, understanding the cosmos, transcending the limitations of the human body, can be transformed by ambition and secrecy and the slow accumulation of power into something that grinds people into dust and calls it progress. The most disturbing thing in Bloodborne is not the beasts in the streets, it is the people who put them there. So, settle in. let the weight of the day begin to lift. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts loosen, and the darkness outside become something comfortable rather than something to be afraid of. We are going back to Yharnam, and this time we are not looking away. To understand the rot at the heart of Bloodborne's world, you have to go back further than the healing church, further than the blood ministration, further than the founding of the workshops, further than the first night of the hunt. You have to go back to a college that no longer functions, sitting at the edge of a forest that no longer permits visitors, its halls long since emptied of the scholars who once walked them. You have to go back to Byrgenwerth. Byrgenwerth is not a place the game asks you to spend a great deal of time in. It is a late game area, reached after passing through the Forbidden Woods, and by the time most players arrive there, they are focused on what lies beyond it. Rom, the vacuous spider, and the veil she maintains over Yharnam's darkest secrets. But if you slow down in Byrgenwerth, if you read the notes left behind and listen to what the space itself is telling you, what you find is the origin point of everything, the place where the first bad decision was made, and where all subsequent bad decisions became not just possible but inevitable. Byrgenwerth was a college of natural philosophy. In the world of Bloodborne, this means something more expansive than the term might suggest in ours. Its scholars were not simply interested in the mechanics of the physical world, but in questions of consciousness, of perception, of what it meant to be a mind embedded in a body, and what it might mean to be something more than that. They were not religious, not in the conventional sense. They did not pray to the gods of the church or seek comfort in ritual. They sought understanding through investigation, through the accumulation of evidence, through the patient and rigorous pursuit of things that could be known. The discovery that changed everything came from beneath the earth. Beneath Yharnam and the surrounding countryside, buried under layers of stone and centuries of silence, lay the Pthumerian ruins. The Pthumerians were an ancient civilization, old in a way that makes the word ancient feel inadequate, old in the way that geological formations are old, in the way that the deep ocean is old. They had risen and fallen long before Yharnam was a city or even a settlement, and what they left behind was not monuments or art or literature, but something stranger and more troubling. Evidence of contact. Evidence that the Pthumerians had found, or been found by, beings that existed on a plane of consciousness so far beyond the human that the gap between them and us was not a matter of degree but of kind. The Great Ones. Byrgenwerth scholars descended into the Pthumerian ruins and found traces of this contact everywhere. In the architecture, which incorporated geometries that seemed designed not to shelter bodies, but to accommodate perceptions that human bodies were not equipped to have. In the artifacts, which hummed with something that was not quite energy and not quite life, but sat in the uncomfortable space between the two. In the blood that still lingered in certain deep chambers, ancient and dark, and carrying within it the residue of a communion that had taken place so long ago that no living thing remembered it. Master Willem led these expeditions. He was Byrgenwerth's most senior scholar, its guiding intelligence, the man around whom its entire intellectual life organized itself. And what he found in the ruins convinced him of something that he spent the rest of his life pursuing with a focus that, by the end, had consumed everything else he was. The Great Ones possessed a higher order of consciousness than human beings. This was not, to Willem, a theological statement. It was an empirical observation. Whatever the Great Ones were, wherever they existed, however they moved through the world, they perceived it in a way that human minds simply could not replicate. They saw more. They understood more. They existed on a plane of awareness that made ordinary human consciousness look like a single candle in a room that the Great Ones experienced as being flooded with light from every direction simultaneously. And Willem believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who has spent his entire intellectual life following evidence wherever it leads, and has arrived somewhere that the evidence, taken seriously, genuinely points, that this difference was physical, biological, a matter of architecture rather than essence. Eyes, not the eyes you use to read or to watch a candle flame or to recognize the faces of people you love. Something deeper, something eternal. Willem's theory, developed across years of study and refined through the examination of the Thumerian remains and the artifacts recovered from the ruins, was that consciousness itself was a function of apertures, that the richness and depth of a being's perception was directly related to the number of angles from which it could receive information about the universe, that the Great Ones saw more because they had more ways of seeing, more eyes, in some sense that was not entirely metaphorical, distributed through their being in ways that had no equivalent in human anatomy. The solution, therefore, was to increase the number of eyes, to line the brain with them, to press them into the grey matter, to distribute them through the flesh and the bone, to remake the human body into something that could receive the universe the way the Great Ones received it, from everywhere at once, with a clarity and a completeness that ordinary human perception could not approach. This is where the experiments began. The details Bloodborne gives us about what actually happened in Byrgenwerth are scattered and partial, distributed across item descriptions and environmental details, and the physical evidence of what was left behind when the college finally emptied. But the picture that assembles itself from those fragments is not a comfortable one. The scholars of Byrgenwerth did not simply theorize about internal eyes, they pursued them, actively, methodically, with the full weight of the college's resources and the complete conviction that what they were doing was not just permitted but necessary. Some of the subjects were willing, we have to acknowledge this. Some of the Byrgenwerth scholars were true believers, men and women who looked at Willem's theory and found it not just plausible but compelling, who understood what was being proposed and agreed to participate in the experiments because they genuinely believed that the transformation they were submitting to was a step towards something magnificent. They wanted to see. They wanted to know. They accepted the cost because they had been persuaded by Willem's arguments, by the evidence of the ruins, by their own hunger for the kind of understanding that ordinary consciousness could not provide, that the cost was worth paying. Others were not willing. The game is careful and indirect about this, but the implication is present in several item descriptions and in the physical configuration of certain spaces in the game. Not everyone who was transformed at Byrgenwerth made that choice freely. Some of the things recovered from the Thumerian ruins, some of the processes developed in the college's deeper chambers were not limited to the scholars who had signed up for enlightenment. The pursuit of eyes on the inside had a momentum that eventually outran the question of consent. The results were visible everywhere by the time the college fell apart. The celestial emissaries that cluster in the upper cathedral ward, pale, bloated, vaguely luminescent, moving with the slow purposelessness of things that have shed most of what made them human, were once scholars. Men and women who sat in the same lecture halls, walked the same corridors, debated the same questions that Willem had been debating for decades. The transformation they underwent was, in some technical sense, successful. They achieved something. Whether what they achieved was anything like what they had been promised is a question the game leaves open, in the way that Bloodborne leaves most of its darkest questions open. Present, impossible to fully resolve, available to anyone willing to look directly at it. The things that float in the lecture building are worse. They have the elongated, attenuated quality of something that was once human and was then stretched towards something else, pulled in the direction of the Great Ones with enough force to change the shape of what they were, but not enough force to complete the journey. They exist in the space between, which is perhaps the worst place of all. Not human enough to have what humans have, not Great One enough to have what the Great Ones have, just suspended in a halfway state for what appears to be a very long time. And Master Willem sat in his chair at the edge of the lake and watched it all happen, and continued to believe that the direction was right, even as the evidence accumulated around him that the cost was higher than he had accounted for. His notes, scattered through Byrgenwerth, do not read like the writings of a man who has had second thoughts. They read like the writings of a man who is still, even at the end, running the calculations, still convinced that the answer is there, just slightly further ahead than he has managed to reach, still certain that the transformation he has set in motion is the correct one, even though the people it has transformed are not, by any reasonable measure, better off than they were before. This is the first and perhaps most important thing Bloodborne establishes about the world it takes place in. The most dangerous people in it are not the ones who want to cause harm. They are the ones who want to cause something else. Transcendence, knowledge, healing, salvation, and who have decided somewhere along the way that the harm is a price worth paying, the ones who have separated the idea from the consequences and fallen so deeply in love with the idea that the consequences have stopped being fully real to them. Willem eventually broke with the most gifted of his students over this question. The student believed the blood should be used more broadly, shared more widely, that the transformation it offered should be available to everyone rather than confined to the scholars who had descended into the ruins and understood what they were working with. His name was Lawrence, and what he went on to build would transform everything Willem had done into a footnote in a much larger and much more terrible story. Lawrence left Byrgenwerth carrying something that did not belong to him. He took the old blood, the blood recovered from the deepest Thumerian ruins, ancient beyond any meaningful reckoning, carrying within it the compressed residue of a contact with the Great Ones that had occurred so long ago, it had become indistinguishable from the blood's own nature. It was not a theft that anyone at Byrgenwerth was in a position to prosecute. Willem was by then too far gone into his own research to pursue the matter, and the college itself was already in the early stages of the dissolution that would eventually leave it empty and sealed. But it was a theft nonetheless. Lawrence took something that had been found through Byrgenwerth's resources and Byrgenwerth's expeditions and Byrgenwerth's institutional knowledge, and he carried it away to build something new with it. He carried it to Yharnam. Yharnam was already, before Lawrence arrived, a city with a reputation for medicine. There was something in its history, some combination of geography and tradition and accumulated knowledge that had made it a place people associated with healing, with care, with the treatment of ailments that other cities had no answer for. Lawrence understood, with the instincts of someone who had spent years studying both natural philosophy and human nature, that this was the perfect foundation for what he wanted to build. He founded the Healing Church, and he built it on a lie. Not a malicious lie, not at first. There is an argument, and it is a real argument worth taking seriously, that Lawrence genuinely believed he was doing something good. The old blood, administered carefully in controlled quantities through the consecrated silver needles that would become the symbol of the church's ministry, genuinely healed people. This is not a fiction that the church invented. Diseases that had been death sentences cleared up. Wounds that should have taken months to close healed in days. The sick became well, the dying recovered, and the people who experienced these cures and the people who watched them happen drew the conclusion that Lawrence needed them to draw, that the blood was a gift, that the church was its steward, that Yharnam was the centre of something miraculous. Pilgrims began arriving from across the known world. This is the mechanism that Bloodborne asks you to understand and sit with, because it is the mechanism that makes everything else possible. The Healing Church did not build its power through coercion, at least not initially. It built it through genuine service. The blood worked. The cures were real. The pilgrims who came to Yharnam sick and left well were not deceived about their own recovery. They were genuinely better. And that genuine good created a reservoir of trust, of gratitude, of institutional legitimacy that the church would eventually draw on to do things that the people who trusted it had never agreed to and would never have agreed to if they had been asked. Lawrence understood something that Philum, for all his brilliance, had never grasped. You do not need to tell people what is being done to them. You simply need to make them want it. The church grew. It built cathedrals, enormous, beautiful, deliberately overwhelming structures designed to communicate power and permanence, and the suggestion that what happened within their walls was connected to something larger and more enduring than any individual human life. It established a hierarchy. At the top, the upper echelons of the church, the choir, the Thumerians who served as its deepest researchers, the senior clergy who understood what the blood actually was and what it actually did. Below them, the rank and file of the church's ministry, priests and healers and administrators who believed, in most cases sincerely, that they were doing the work they appeared to be doing. Below them, the city of Yharnam itself drinking the blood and going about its life and trusting that the institution at the centre of everything was what it said it was. And below all of that, invisible and unacknowledged, the truth. The blood was transforming people, not quickly, not in ways that were immediately visible, not in ways that the church could be easily held accountable for. But the old blood, even diluted, even administered in controlled quantities through the church's careful ministry, carried within it the same essential property that had destroyed Byrgenwerth. Prolonged exposure changed people. Subtly at first, a tendency toward aggression that could be explained away as temperament, a paranoia that could be attributed to the stresses of city life, a hypersensitivity to the presence of others that manifested as irritability, and then as fear, and then as something else entirely, and then, over time, less subtly. The transformation that Byrgenwerth had induced through direct experimentation, the blood induced through patience, through the slow accumulation of ministration after ministration, year after year, generation after generation, until the city's relationship with the blood had become so fundamental that its effects were indistinguishable from the city's own nature. The beast plague was not an accident. It was not an unforeseen consequence. It was, at some point in the Church's history, a known outcome, understood by the upper levels of the institution as the inevitable endpoint of blood ministration on a population scale, the thing that happened to cities that drank long enough and deeply enough from the cup that Lawrence had offered them. The Church knew. This is the sentence that everything else in Bloodborne's lore hinges on. The Church knew. Not every member. The rank-and-file healers administering the blood were, in most cases, genuinely ignorant of what they were participating in. But the people at the top, the people who had access to the research that had been done in the Parthymerian ruins and the Byrgenwerth archives and the upper floors of the Grand Cathedral, understood what the blood was doing to Yharnam and chose to continue anyway. Because stopping would have meant admitting what had been done. It would have meant dismantling the cathedrals and the hierarchy and the centuries of accumulated institutional power and standing before the city and the world and saying, "We were wrong, we harmed you. The thing we gave you was not a gift but a slow sentence. And we knew it, and we continued." It would have required a reckoning that no institution at any point in Bloodborne's history proved capable of performing, so instead they built the hunt. If the beast plague was inevitable, then the beast needed to be managed. The workshop was established, a parallel institution, kept at arm's length from the Church in ways that gave the Church plausible deniability, populated by hunters who were given weapons and cloaks, and the understanding that what happened on the nights of the hunt was necessary without being given the full picture of why it was necessary, or who was responsible for the necessity. The population was instructed to lock their doors and shutter their windows and wait for morning. The beasts, the people who had transformed, the men and women and children who had drunk the blood and been changed by it into something the city could no longer accommodate, were burned and buried. And in the morning, the Church opened its doors and offered the blood ministration to anyone who came seeking it. The symmetry of this, the creation of the problem and the management of the problem by the same institution, is the kind of structural observation that Bloodborne trusts the player to make without stating it outright. The Healing Church was both the source of the beast plague and the institution responsible for controlling it. The hunt was not a response to a crisis, it was a maintenance program, a recurring cleanup operation, for the predictable consequences of a process the Church had no intention of stopping. Lawrence himself did not escape the blood's effects. This is something the Old Hunter's DLC reveals, and it is one of the most devastating details in the game. The man who founded the Healing Church, the man who took the blood from Byrgenwerth and built an empire of healing around it, who stood before Willem and promised that he would not make the same mistakes, that he would be careful, that he understood the risks, became a beast. The cleric beast, the game strongly implies, is what Lawrence became. The first vicar of the Healing Church, transformed by the very substance he had spent his life administering, reduced to a thing of fire and bone and screaming on the steps of the grand cathedral. And the church continued. That is the detail that completes the picture of what the healing church was. The founder transformed, the promise to Willem broken in the most literal way possible, the evidence of what the blood does made manifest in the body of the man who brought it to Yharnam. And the institution he built looked at this, looked at the thing their founder had become, and decided that what was needed was not a reckoning but a successor, a new vicar, a new face at the top of the hierarchy, a new person to continue the work that the previous person had been consumed by. Vicar Amelia, whom you meet early in the game, is the latest in this succession. She is on her knees in the grand cathedral when you find her, clutching the gold pendant, praying, genuinely praying, with the desperate focus of someone who is trying to hold something together through sheer force of devotion. She knows what is happening to her. The transformation has already begun. The beast is already present, underneath the prayer, underneath the vestments, underneath the title that was given to her by an institution that had every reason to know what the title eventually costs the person who holds it. She prays until she cannot pray anymore, and then the beast takes over and you fight what she has become, and the church continues without her the way it continued without Lawrence. The system does not need any particular person. It only needs a person. Any person will do. Byrgenwerth had experimented on scholars. Most of them had in some sense chosen their involvement. The healing church experimented on an entire city, across generations, without ever once asking the city's permission. High above the main body of Yharnam, accessible through a gate that was kept locked to all but the most senior members of the church, the upper cathedral ward sat like a secret the city was keeping from itself. Everything below the gate was the church as it presented itself to the world. The healing, the ministry, the cathedrals with their candles and their ceremony, the hunters with their purpose and their cloaks. Everything above the gate was something else. The choir occupied the upper reaches of the cathedral ward, and the choir was not a musical organisation or a devotional assembly. The choir was Byrgenwerth's legacy, carrying forward the work that Willem had begun under the auspices of an institution with considerably more resources and considerably fewer restraints. Their goal was direct communion with the Great Ones, not the diluted second-hand contact of blood ministration, not the faint resonance of the Great One's nature that lingered in the old blood after generations of Thumerian contact and further processing. Something immediate, something overwhelming, a connection that would bridge the gap between human consciousness and Great One consciousness in a single, transformative moment, producing the kind of enlightenment that Byrgenwerth had been reaching toward but had never managed to achieve before its dissolution. To get there, they needed eyes. Specifically, the eyes of the Great Ones. Physical objects, or objects that were physical in some sense, recovered from sources that the game reveals gradually and with deliberate restraint. We will get to the primary source of those eyes later, in the chapter on the fishing Hamlet. For now, what matters is what the choir did with them once they had them. The research hall, which players can access through the Old Hunters DLC, is one of the most carefully constructed spaces in the game. From a distance, from the perspective of someone who has not read the notes and examined the bodies and Followed the implications, it looks like a hospital. Long wards with beds along the walls, the faint smell of antiseptic and old wood, the institutional quality of a place designed for the systematic care of large numbers of people, the architecture of compassion, or at least of the performance of compassion. But the patients in the research hall are not healing. They move through the ward in a way that is immediately viscerally wrong, scratching at their own heads with a focused, desperate attention, reaching upward with both hands toward a ceiling they cannot touch, producing sounds that the human voice is not generally asked to produce. They are not in ordinary pain. The game communicates this through their movement and their sound rather than through any explicit description. There is something in the way they reach, the quality of their distress, that suggests they are experiencing something that has gone so far beyond the ordinary registers of suffering that the nervous system no longer has a category for it. The choir was pressing eyes into their skulls. Literally. The physical eyes recovered from the sources we will discuss. From Kos, from the Thumerian ruins, from whatever else the upper church had managed to accumulate, were being grafted into the bodies and the minds of the research hall's patients. The process was not metaphorical or symbolic. It was surgical, or something adjacent to surgery, conducted by researchers who believed that what they were doing was the highest expression of the church's original mission, not healing the sick, but elevating the human species towards something that transcended sickness entirely. The notes left behind in the research hall speak in the careful, detached language of institutional research, of progress, of patients who achieved moments of clarity during the grafting process, of brief windows in which the subject's perception appeared to expand in ways that were observable, behavioral changes, vocalizations, responses to stimuli that suggested an awareness of things not present in the ordinary physical environment, of the researchers' conviction that they were on the right track, that the transformations they were observing represented steps on the path toward the communion they were seeking. They do not speak much about what happened after those moments of clarity. They do not dwell on the patient's subsequent condition, on the scratching and the reaching and the sounds that the wards filled with as the grafting process ran its course. They do not record whether any of the patients were asked if they wanted to participate, or whether they were given any information about what was going to be done to them, or whether there was any process by which they could have declined. The language of the notes is the language of a research program, and research programs have a tendency to record outcomes while omitting the texture of the experience of the people those outcomes happen to. There is a related horror in Yahar'gul, the unseen village, that connects to the choir's work in a way that the game leaves for you to assemble on your own. The bodies in Yahar'gul are fused, not merely piled or arranged, but physically merged. Stone and flesh and bone pressed together into configurations that do not occur in nature, and that the word surgery is not adequate to describe. You find them in the walls, you find them in their pillars, you find them in formations that suggest someone was experimenting with the boundary between a human body and its environment, testing whether a consciousness could be distributed across multiple forms, whether the edges of a person could be made to blur into the edges of the space around them, the way the Great One's edges blur into everything. These were the inmates, the school of Mensis, working from the same intellectual tradition as the choir, but with less restraint and less institutional oversight, used the citizens of Yahar'gul as raw material. The people who lived in that district, ordinary Yharnamites who had the misfortune of living in the wrong part of the city when the school decided it needed subjects, were folded into the architecture of the ritual. Some were used in the Mensis ritual directly, their minds pulled into the nightmare alongside the school's scholars. Others were subjected to processes that the game depicts in the fused bodies and the caged figures and the sounds that play when you move through certain corridors of Yharnam after dark. Processes that the school justified, presumably, as necessary steps toward the communion they were pursuing. The One Reborn is the fullest expression of this logic. That immense, shambling, grotesque thing that drops from the sky in Yharnam is not a single being. It is an accumulation, a mass of bodies, fused and reanimated, arranged into a rough approximation of something that the School of Mensis believed could serve as a vessel for the kind of cosmic contact they were pursuing. The bodies that comprise it were not donated. They were taken, collected from the streets by the Snatchers, processed by the school, and assembled into something that the people who made it probably described in their internal notes as an achievement. The bell-ringing women who stand above the One Reborn during the fight. The women in the red cloaks, positioned on the balconies overlooking the plaza, are maintaining it, keeping it active, channeling whatever force holds the fused bodies in their unnatural configuration. If you kill them, the One Reborn weakens. If you leave them, it persists. This is what the choir's experiments and the school's rituals share. Not a method, their methods were different, sometimes dramatically so, but a posture. The posture of an institution that has identified its subjects as material, that has looked at a human being and seen, not a person with a history and a family and a preference, about whether their body is fused into a wall, but a resource, an input, a component in a process whose output is valued so highly that the nature of the input has stopped being a relevant consideration. Lady Maria knew what was happening. Maria is one of Bloodborne's most compelling and most tragic figures, a hunter of the first rank, a student of Yharnam, a woman whose skill and dedication and genuine moral seriousness had brought her to the upper levels of the Church's world. She was present during the research hall's operation. She knew what was being done to the patients there. She knew they could not be healed, could not be restored to what they had been before the grafting process began. She knew that what had been done to them was irreversible, and so she sealed the hall. She could not undo it. She could not heal them or free them or give back what had been taken. She could only close the door and carry the knowledge of what she had been part of, carry it through, whatever remained of her life, and then into the hunter's nightmare where you eventually find her, waiting at the top of the astral clock tower with a grief so old and so thoroughly incorporated into her bearing that it has become indistinguishable from dignity. When you fight her, she fights with everything she has. She does not want to be found. She does not want to be disturbed. She has been keeping watch over a horror for what appears to be a very long time, and the last thing she needs is someone coming to remind her of it. She is one of the only people in Bloodborne's world who understood what was being done, and responded to that understanding with something that looks, from a distance, like conscience. It did not save anyone, but it is worth noting in a world where almost no one else managed it, that she tried. There is a particular enemy in the Nightmare of Mensis that experienced Bloodborne players learn to treat with a specific and very focused kind of dread. They appear at a distance, drifting through the fog with a soft pulsing light emanating from the region of their heads. A warm, almost comfortable light that sits in strange contrast to the darkness around it. They move with a slow, searching quality, arms occasionally extending as though reaching for something just beyond their grasp. They hum, not loudly, not aggressively, just a low, continuous sound that carries through the fog and reaches you before they do, so that you know they are coming before you can see them clearly. If they catch you, if their gaze locks onto yours for even a fraction of a second, the frenzy begins. And frenzy, in Bloodborne, is not like other damage. It does not chip away at your health bar in the orderly way that a sword or a beast's claws does. It builds and builds, and if you cannot break the gaze and find cover and wait for it to recede, it kills you almost instantly, in a way that feels less like being struck and more like being overwhelmed, like something pressing against the inside of your skull from every direction at once. They are called winter lanterns. What they are, beneath the light and the horror of their gaze, is something the game communicates only obliquely, in the way Bloodborne always communicates its most important truths, through item descriptions and environmental implication, and the slow assembly of a picture that you would perhaps rather not see clearly. They were hunters, not beasts, not failed experiments in the research hall sense. People who entered the hunter's nightmare. The same nightmare you're moving through, and who encountered something in that place that the game never quite names directly, but whose effects are visible in everything the winter lanterns are and do. The light that emanates from where their head should be is not a natural light, and is not a mechanical one. It is the light of eyes that have been pressed into their skulls, the same process the choir was pursuing in the research hall, the same transformation that the patients there were undergoing, carried here into the nightmare and run to its absolute terminus. The winter lanterns are what happens when the eye grafting works, or rather when it works past the point of return, when the number of eyes incorporated into a consciousness exceeds whatever threshold exists between transformation and obliteration. Whatever the hunters who became winter lanterns were before, whatever names they had, whatever they remembered, whatever constituted their sense of themselves as particular people with particular histories, is gone. What replaced it is something so saturated with perception, so overwhelmed with the raw data of a consciousness that is now receiving the universe from too many angles at once that nothing else remains. The hum. The hum is what that saturation sounds like from the outside. It is the acoustic signature of a mind that is experiencing so much in so many directions simultaneously that it has collapsed into a single sustained note of pure perception. No language, because language requires the kind of linear sequential processing that is no longer available. No memory, because memory requires a self to store things in relation to, and the self has been dissolved. No intention, because intention requires a gap between what is and what is desired, and the winter lanterns have no gap. They are entirely what they are, completely and without remainder, in every moment. The frenzy they inflict is not an attack. They are not trying to harm you. The frenzy is simply what proximity to their consciousness does to a human mind that has not undergone the same transformation. A kind of resonance, the way a strong enough sound can shatter glass not by striking it but simply by vibrating at the right frequency. Your mind, encountering the Winter Lantern's consciousness at close range, begins to vibrate at a frequency it cannot sustain. The result is called frenzy. The experience of it, from the inside, is presumably something else entirely. When you kill a Winter Lantern, you sometimes receive a vermin. This is a small detail that Bloodborne drops into your inventory with no fanfare, no explanation, no acknowledgement of how troubling it is. The vermin, a tiny, wriggling thing, the same item produced by the Impurity Rune, the same item that Annalise, Queen of the Vile Bloods, requests that you crush in her name as an act of devotion to her cause. The implication, and Bloodborne is always working in implications, always placing one thing beside another and leaving you to complete the picture, is that the vermin is what remains of the person, the small, compressed residue of the hunter who entered the nightmare and was found by the process that made Winter Lanterns curled up inside the light like the stone inside a fruit, preserved but unreachable, present but no longer in any meaningful sense there. It is one of the quietest horrors in the game. It does not announce itself. It sits in your inventory and waits for you to understand what it is. Not all of Bloodborne's most disturbing moments involve cosmic entities or institutional cruelty on a grand scale. Not all of them require the full weight of the Healing Church's machinery or the ambitions of scholars who reach too far towards something they were not built to touch. Some of them happen in a small room, off a side street to a woman who was only trying to survive the night. Arianna is one of the NPCs you encounter early in the game, in the streets of the Cathedral ward. She is a sex worker. The game does not use that language, but it is clear enough from the context and the way certain other characters in the game treat her. And she is, despite the circumstances, one of the more composed and self-possessed people you meet in Yharnam. She does not panic. She does not beg. She assesses the situation. A night of particular violence, worse than usual, the hunt running hot in ways that suggest something extraordinary is happening, and she accepts your offer to take her somewhere safer with the directness that suggests she's accustomed to making pragmatic decisions in difficult circumstances. You can send her to Udon Chapel, which is where most players send the survivors they find. She arrives there and takes up a place in the corner, and if you speak to her, she's polite and composed and grateful in a measured way that never tips into effusiveness. She is, by the standards of Bloodborne's NPCs, many of whom are either already lost or rapidly declining, remarkably stable. If you progress far enough into the game, she offers you her blood. This is a gift freely given. She volunteers it without being asked, explaining that her blood has unusual properties, that there is something in its composition that she cannot fully account for, some quality that sets it apart from ordinary Yharnamite blood, and that given what you are doing and what the night is demanding of you, it seems like the right thing to offer. She does not ask for anything in return. She does not make it a transaction. She gives because she wants to help, because she is a person who, despite everything the night is doing, has not lost the capacity for generosity. Near the end of the game, if you return to Udon Chapel, you find her in the corner. She has given birth. The thing beside her is not a child in any sense that the word child is intended to cover. It is small and wet, and it moves with the boneless, searching quality of something that has never had bones and does not miss them. It is, in the game's taxonomy, related to a great one's umbilical cord. one of the 3 that you need to consume to access the game's 3rd ending. It is extraordinary, and it is terrible, and it is lying beside a woman who is slumped against the wall, barely conscious, having survived a birth that should not have been physiologically possible, and that she clearly did not anticipate. The game does not explain how this happened. It does not need to. Eden is the formless Great One. He exists in Bloodborne's world as sound, as breath, as presence, distributed through the air of Yharnam in a way that is everywhere and nowhere, impossible to locate and impossible to fully escape. His name is connected to blood, specifically to blood as a medium through which he acts and moves and makes contact with the world. The Udenraith rune, the Uden tomb, the whispered references to his influence throughout the game all point to the same implication. Eden is present in the blood, and in Yharnam the blood is everywhere. Arianna's blood was unusual, different from ordinary Yharnamite blood in ways she could not explain. The game's implication, available to anyone willing to follow the thread, is that her lineage connects to the Vile Bloods, the Cainhurst nobles whose blood was already touched by something old and strange. That her blood, in its unusual composition, was close enough to what Eden moves through that his presence found it and found her, and the result is the thing lying beside her on the floor of Udon Chapel. She never knew it was happening. She had no warning, no understanding, no opportunity to consent or refuse. She was used as a vessel by a force so far beyond her comprehension that the question of whether she would have agreed is one the force never thought to ask. And when it was over, when the thing that had been growing in her was born, she was left in a corner of a chapel in a ruined city, barely alive, having paid a price she never agreed to for something she never sought. If you speak to her after this, she says almost nothing useful. She is present but hollowed out, not in the way that Bloodborne's transforming NPCs are hollowed out, not becoming something else, just diminished, as though the birth took something that was not physical and that the game has no name for. And the other people in the chapel, the ones you sent there to keep them safe, the other survivors of the night, do not help her. The chapel dweller who tends the space is kind enough in his way, but has no framework for understanding what happened to her. The suspicious beggar, if he is still present, is concerned with his own agenda. Adela, the nun, has been watching Arianna with an intensity that has nothing to do with compassion. This small community of survivors that you assembled in the chapel, the collection of people you tried to save by bringing them to the one safe place left in Yharnam, does not rally around the woman in the corner who has just been through something that none of them can comprehend. They continue their own internal dramas. They continue their own survival. Arianna is, in this sense, a perfect miniature of what Bloodborne is saying about the relationship between individuals and the systems they exist within. She did everything right. She made sensible choices. She went where she was told to go. She stayed where she was told to stay. She trusted the protection that was offered to her, and it was not enough. The thing that happened to her was not a consequence of her choices, but of her blood, which she did not choose, and of the chapel which she went to on your advice, and of a great one whose interest in her had nothing to do with who she was and everything to do with what she was made of. She is, in the language of the institution, collateral, an incidental cost of a process that was not aimed at her. The Great Ones are not malevolent. Udon did not set out to harm Arianna. But the harm happened, and it was total, and it was invisible to the systems that might have prevented it, and the woman at the centre of it was left in a corner with a thing that should not exist, and a wound that no one in Yharnam's remaining population has the capacity to see, much less to treat. It is the most human horror in Bloodborne. Not the cosmic scale of the Great Ones or the institutional cruelty of the Healing Church, but the simple, devastating fact of a person who trusted the wrong space on the wrong night and paid for it with something she can never get back, and who is never acknowledged by the world around her as having paid anything at all. We are halfway through the night, if you are still with me. If the darkness has settled into something comfortable around you, if the weight of the day has begun to lift and your thoughts have loosened from the grip of everything that waits for you in the morning, then you are exactly where you're supposed to be. If you are enjoying what Nightfall Lore does, consider subscribing. Long, slow, atmospheric deep dives into the games that deserve to be understood fully. That is what this channel is for. It helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more where this came from. Now, back to Yharnam. In the Nightmare of Mensis, past the Rom Gate and the brain that hangs in the sky and the creatures that drift through the fog with their terrible patience, there is a place that the game marks differently from everything around it. The architecture changes, the sound changes, the quality of the darkness shifts in a way that is difficult to articulate but immediately perceptible, as though you have crossed some threshold between ordinary nightmare and something that the word nightmare is insufficient to describe. This is where Mergo is kept, and standing over Mergo, as she has been standing since before you arrived, and will presumably stand long after you have gone, is the wet nurse. She is enormous. Not in the way that the game's other large enemies are enormous. Not with the aggressive, threatening enormity of the blood-starved beast or the cleric beast. Not with the cosmic, incomprehensible enormity of Rom. Her size has a different quality to it. It is the size of something that has been appointed to a function and grown to fit that function over a very long period of time. She wears robes, dark, layered, the robes of a caretaker, of someone whose role is defined by tending to something smaller and more vulnerable than herself. She moves with the unhurried certainty of something that has been in this particular place for a very long time, and has absolutely no expectation of leaving. She does not speak. She does not threaten. She interposes herself between you and Mergo with the quiet authority of an institution, and then she opens. The robes open. What you took for a back and a pair of wings unfolds to reveal something else. Additional arms, dark and feathered, arranged around her body in a radial pattern, extending outward like the petals of a flower made of reaching hands. Each one moves independently. The space around her fills with the slow, searching movement of appendages that were designed for a purpose that the game never quite names. She is a servant of the Great Ones, specifically assigned, specifically placed at this specific location, for this specific purpose. Stand here. Protect this. Do not leave. Consider what that means. Consider the duration of it. The Nightmare of Mensis has existed for what appears to be a very long time. Long enough for the School of Mensis' ritual to have become ancient history by the standards of anyone who might have remembered it. The wet nurse has been here for all of that time, standing, waiting, not growing old, not growing impatient, not experiencing the passage of time in any way that produces the restlessness or the doubt or the questioning that would eventually erode a human being's commitment to a vigil this long. She is simply here in the way that a wall is here, in the way that gravity is here, present as a function rather than as a personality. She has no face. This detail is easy to miss in the chaos of the fight that follows, but it matters. Beneath the hood there is nothing. Or rather, there is darkness. The kind of darkness that reads not as the absence of a face, but as the presence of something that a face would be inadequate to contain. She does not need a face. She does not need expressions or the capacity to communicate, or any of the apparatus that beings who exist in relationship with other beings require. Her relationship is with her function. Everything else has been either removed or was never there to begin with. During the fight, there is a phase in which the arena darkens. The already dim space plunges into something close to total blackness, and the wet nurse's movements change. She becomes faster, more aggressive, and there appear to be more of her than there were a moment ago, as though the darkness has given her permission to be fully what she is, in a way that the residual light had been constraining. It is one of the most disorienting moments in Bloodborne's boss roster, and its disorientation is the point. You are fighting something that is more itself in the dark, something that the light was not revealing but concealing. Whatever the wet nurse actually is, whatever she looks like when she is not performing the role of guardian in a way that a human observer can pass, the darkness phase is the closest you get to seeing it. There is something in the wet nurse's existence, in the totality of her commitment to this single function, in the way her entire being has been oriented around the thing she guards, that is more disturbing than most of Bloodborne's more explicit horrors. She's not a monster in the conventional sense. She's not cruel, not aggressive, not even particularly interested in you as an entity until you become a threat to what she is protecting. She's simply a guardian, fulfilling a role, and the horror is in what the role implies. Something needed to be guarded here. Something needed to be kept in this specific place, in this specific condition permanently. Something that could not be left alone. And the being assigned to ensure this was not given a personality or a will or any of the things that might, over the course of an eternity, cause her to question whether the guarding was still necessary. She was given arms and darkness and the capacity to kill anything that came too close and nothing else. The Great Ones, in their way, built an institution around Mergo, a single employee institution with a single mandate and no oversight and no expiration date. And like every other institution in Bloodborne, it continued long past the point where anyone had asked whether it should. What she is guarding is what we need to talk about now. Mergo is the child of Queen Yharnam. Queen Yharnam, not to be confused with the city, was a Thumerian queen, one of the great nobles of that ancient civilization, whose lineage connected to the Great Ones through channels of blood and communion that the game traces only partially. She appears throughout Bloodborne as a spectral figure, glimpsed at a distance, never quite reachable, standing on balconies and at the ends of corridors, her robes soaked with blood that has been flowing for what appears to be a very long time, her arms extended in a gesture that looks like offering and like pleading in equal measure. The blood comes from wounds that have never healed. The wounds come from the birth. Mergo was the child she had with a Great One. The game's indications point toward Oan's, though as with much of Bloodborne's deepest lore, the identification is more suggested than confirmed. The birth of a child between a human and a Great One is, in the world of Bloodborne, not an unprecedented event. The game implies that such connections have occurred before, that the Great One's interest in humanity has a specific and recurring expression that takes the form of attempted reproduction, of reaching toward humanity in the most intimate way available, and producing something that partakes of both natures. Mergo was stillborn. Set that down and look at it for a moment. The child of a Thumerian queen and a Great One, born dead. Never drew a breath, never opened its eyes, never existed in the world in any of the ways that existence ordinarily requires. Born, and then immediately, irrevocably, not. Queen Yharnam has been mourning this child for an incomprehensible length of time. The Thumerians existed so long before the events of the game that ordinary timescales do not apply. She has been standing in corridors, bleeding from wounds that will not close, extending her arms towards something that is not there, for longer than Yharnam has been a city, longer than Byrgenwerth was a thought. Her grief is so old that it has become structural. It is not something she feels, but something she is. The way a canyon is not something the river feels, but something the river has become over a duration that makes the word feeling meaningless. When you encounter her in the game, those brief, spectral appearances, always at a distance, always just beyond the edge of interaction, she does not attack you. She does not threaten you. She seems to be trying to show you something, or to lead you somewhere, and the somewhere is always in the direction of Mergo. She wants you to find her child. Whether she wants you to save it or release it or simply acknowledge that it exists is a question the game does not answer, and the ambiguity is the point. A mother who has been grieving for aeons may no longer be able to distinguish between those things. She may simply want someone else to hear what she has been hearing. The crying you hear throughout the Nightmare of Mensis, that thin, distant infant sound that drifts through the fog and follows you between lanterns, that you can hear before you understand what you're hearing, and that does not become more comfortable once you do understand it, is the crying of that child. The child that did not survive its own birth is crying in the nightmare, has been crying since the nightmare was created, will presumably continue crying until something intervenes. The nightmare exists in part to preserve that crying, to hold Mergo in a state that is neither life nor death, not alive, because the birth ended without life beginning, but not gone in the way that death ordinarily means gone, because the Great One's nature does not permit that kind of simple departure. The nightmare is a space between states, and Mergo is suspended in it, held in place by the structure of the nightmare itself, and by the wet nurse, and by whatever it is about a Great One's stillborn child that makes the universe apparently unwilling to let it simply be at rest. The School of Mensis made contact with Mergo deliberately. This requires some understanding of who the School of Mensis was. They were, broadly speaking, a faction within the upper levels of the Healing Church, researchers and scholars in the Byrgenwerth tradition, pursuing the communion with the Great Ones that the choir was also pursuing, but through a different and considerably more reckless methodology, where the choir worked carefully, systematically, with the patience of an institution that had resources and time and the protection of the Church's authority. The School of Mensis worked with a feverish urgency, that suggest they were driven by something beyond ordinary scholarly ambition. They knew about Mergo through the Thumerian archives, through their own expeditions into the ruins, through whatever combination of research and revelation had brought them to this specific piece of knowledge. They understood that a stillborn Great One existed in a nightmare space and could be contacted, and they understood, with the particular excitement of researchers who have found a source of power that no one else has yet exploited, that contact with Mergo would give them access to something unprecedented. They built their ritual. They brought their members into a shared nightmare, the Nightmare of Mensis, wearing the iron helms that appear throughout the area, the helms designed to shield their minds from the full weight of the Great One's presence at close range. They reached toward Mergo with everything they had. It did not go well. Most of the School of Mensis members ended up as the figures you find seated throughout the nightmare. Bodies still present, still breathing in some technical sense, but with no one inside them anymore. Their minds went into the nightmare and did not fully return. What remained was the physical shell, maintaining its position, persisting in a state that is alive in every sense except the one that matters. Only Micolash retained enough of himself to continue functioning in the nightmare. He retained enough to keep moving, to keep reaching toward Mergo, to keep pursuing the communion that had cost everyone around him their minds. Whether this makes him the most successful member of the School of Mensis or the most damaged is a question that Bloodborne is wise enough not to answer directly. But the thing that sits at the centre of all of this, the thing that Bloodborne plants in your understanding and leaves there, is Mergo itself. A child that died before it ever lived, held in a nightmare constructed around its own existence, crying without cease in a darkness that has no morning. Not suffering in the way that a living being suffers, perhaps. The game is careful not to make this claim explicitly, but present somehow in whatever state lies between being and not being. And the people who built the structure around that presence, who made it the centre of their ritual and their research and their hunger for the Great One's power, never once appear to have asked what Mergo might want, or whether what was being built around that crying was a comfort or an additional cruelty. When you defeat the wet nurse, and the game tells you that Mergo has passed on, that the infant spirit has finally at last moved on to wherever it was supposed to go, the tone of the announcement is muted. The nightmare begins to dissolve. There is no fanfare. It does not feel like a victory. It feels like something that should have happened a very long time ago, finally being permitted to happen. Like a door that was locked for no good reason being opened. Like the end of something that should never have been prolonged as long as it was. The Snatchers of Yharnam move through the game's streets with a particular kind of menace that is worth examining more closely than a first encounter usually allows. They are enormous, easily twice the height of a human, broad across the shoulders, dressed in dark coats that have the quality of institutional clothing, of uniforms that were issued rather than chosen. They move with a purposefulness that is different from the purposefulness of beasts, which is driven by hunger and transformation, and the dissolution of the self. The Snatchers move like people doing a job, like workers fulfilling a function they have been assigned, carrying out a task that has a beginning and an end and a clear sense of what constitutes successful completion. They carry burlap sacks. The sacks are large enough to hold a human being. If you look at them at the right moment, in the right light, some of the sacks appear to move. The Snatchers are associated with Yharnam, the unseen village, the hidden district of Yharnam that the School of Mensis occupied and used as a base for their operations. Getting to Yharnam requires either dying to a Snatcher, which triggers an alternate entrance, or finding your own way there later in the game. Either way, what you find when you arrive is a district that has been comprehensively repurposed, its original residents either absent or transformed, its streets patrolled by things that were not always what they currently are. The question of what the Snatchers actually are, what they were before the School of Mensis made them what they currently are, is one that the game approaches with its characteristic indirection. There is no item description that says directly, these are former citizens of Yharnam, transformed through the school's processes into tools for its own continuation. But the implications are everywhere, in the body shape and the clothing and the way they move and the function they serve. The Snatchers take people from the streets. They have always taken people from the streets. This function, this specific purposeful collection of human beings from the city around them, depositing those human beings in the unseen village for reasons that the city at large was never told, predates whatever transformation turned the Snatchers into what they currently are. Someone had to be doing this work before the Snatchers existed. Someone had to be going out into Yharnam's streets, identifying targets, collecting them, bringing them back. The implication is that the Snatchers are the continuation of that function, built from the people who once performed it. That the process that created them, whatever the School of Mensis did to produce beings capable of this work with this degree of reliable efficiency, incorporated something of the original workers into the result. The muscle memory of the function, the physical capacity for the task, the complete removal of whatever part of a person might have hesitated. What they were, before, was people who knew what was happening in Yharnam and participated in it anyway. Whether that participation was voluntary or coerced, whether they were true believers or simply people who had been given no alternative, the game does not say. What it implies is that they became what they are through the same processes that the school applied to everyone else. Through being used, as everyone in Bloodborne's world is eventually used, by an institution that had decided that its goals justified whatever it took to achieve them. The truly disturbing thing is not the transformation, it is the continuation. The Snatchers are still doing the same work they were doing before, still going out into the streets, still filling the sacks, still bringing the city's people to the unseen village. The process that remade them left the instruction intact and simply removed the capacity for refusal. Think about what that means from the perspective of the people they collect. You are a citizen of Yharnam. You have survived the hunt night after night. You have locked your doors and burned your incense and kept your head down, and you have made it through. And then one evening something enormous arrives on your street that is not a beast, that moves with too much purpose to be a beast, that carries a sack instead of claws, that does not want to eat you but wants something else, wants to bring you somewhere, and the somewhere is a district of the city you may not have even known existed. There is no record in the game of anyone being returned from Yharnam. No NPC tells you about a relative who was taken and then came back. No item description mentions a survivor of the unseen village who escaped and told the city what was happening. The traffic is one-directional. People go in, they do not come out. And the city somehow does not ask about them loudly enough for the asking to matter. This is a quiet detail that the game trusts you to notice on your own. The disappearances have been happening for long enough that they should be a crisis. Entire families, entire streets, entire neighbourhoods thinned out by the Snatchers' work. And yet the city continues. The healing church continues to minister the blood. The hunts continue. The doors are barred. The incense burns. And in the morning the city opens again and does not count who is missing. Because counting would mean acknowledging, and acknowledging would mean questioning, and questioning the institutions that run Yharnam is not something the city has ever been equipped to do. The Snatchers operate in the gap between what the city knows and what the city permits itself to know, and that gap is wide enough to hold an entire district full of horrors that no one outside it has ever been asked to account for. The Snatchers are, in this reading, the most honest institution in Yharnam. They are the city's relationship with its own citizens made literal, the process by which people are consumed by the system they live in, stripped of their capacity to refuse and repurposed for the system's own ends. Every other institution in Bloodborne disguises this process behind ceremony or theology or the language of healing. The Snatchers have no disguise. They simply arrive and they take and they leave, and the city closes its shutters and waits for morning. There is a boss fight in Bloodborne that is unlike any other in the game. No sweeping orchestral score, no arena designed to communicate the weight and significance of what you are about to face. No creature that has been transformed by the blood into something terrible and magnificent. Just a man in an iron helm, running away from you through a series of mirrored rooms, pausing occasionally to thrust his arm through a cage and call down a kin attack, and delivering fragments of philosophy at the ceiling, with the intensity of someone who is not performing for your benefit, but simply continuing a conversation you have interrupted. Micolash, host of the Nightmare, is one of the most fully realized human figures in Bloodborne, which is a game populated primarily by transformations and absence. He is recognizably a person, a specific person, with a specific history and a specific set of ideas that he has followed to their logical conclusion, and then somewhat past it. He quotes Kos, he invokes the Great Ones. He runs not because he is a coward, but because he is genuinely more interested in what he was doing before you arrived than in the confrontation you are insisting on. He was a senior member of the School of Mensis, a scholar in the tradition of Byrgenwerth, who had found in that tradition not just an intellectual framework, but a complete account of what mattered and what it meant to pursue it. He was there when the school performed the ritual that brought them into contact with the Nightmare of Mensis. He was there when his colleagues' minds were consumed by the contact. He was there when the school's grand project arrived at its destination, which was not what any of them had expected. And unlike everyone else present, he survived the arrival, or survived it in some sense. His mind held together, not intact exactly, but coherent enough to continue functioning in the Nightmare, to continue moving and thinking and pursuing the communion with Mergo that the ritual had been designed to achieve. Whether this makes him more resilient than his colleagues or simply differently damaged is a distinction the game does not adjudicate. What matters is that he is here, in the Nightmare, and he has been here long enough that the Nightmare has become, in some genuine sense, his home. His colleagues were not so fortunate. The word fortunate is doing complicated work in that sentence, because it is not clear that what happened to Micolash is better than what happened to them, but it is different. The other members of the School of Mensis are the figures you find scattered throughout Yharnam and the Nightmare, seated still, their posture suggesting that they sat down at a specific moment and simply never stood again. Their bodies breathe. If you look closely, you can see the rise and fall of their chests, the involuntary continuations of a body that has not received the signal to stop. But the people who inhabited those bodies are gone. Their minds went into the nightmare at the moment of the ritual and did not come back, and what remains is not a person, but a record of the moment the person departed, a body frozen in the last position it occupied before its occupant went somewhere else, and found that the somewhere else did not include a return journey. There are dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, seated in the chairs of Yharnam's lecture halls, slumped against the walls of its corridors, arranged in configurations that suggest they were following a protocol when the ritual began, that they had prepared, that they had positions, that they believed the preparation would be sufficient. The Mensis cages on their heads, the iron frames that were supposed to protect their minds from the worst of the contact, are still in place. They did not help. The iron helm he wears is part of what preserved him. The Mensis cage, the iron structure worn by the school's members, was designed to shield the mind from the full weight of direct Great One contact. It worked for Micolash in the sense that his mind was not simply erased by the contact as his colleagues were. Whether it worked in any other sense is less clear. His behaviour in the nightmare, the running, the philosophical fragments, the complete indifference to outcomes that other beings consider important, like continued physical existence, suggests a mind that is intact in some dimensions and not intact in others. His dialogue is one of the game's most carefully constructed elements. On the surface, it is the raving of a madman. Disconnected fragments, invocations of Kos and the Great Ones, requests for the grant of eyes that carry the quality of prayer from someone who has long since moved past the stage of expecting a response. But if you listen closely, if you follow the thread of what he is actually saying, what emerges is something more coherent than it appears. He understands, or believes he understands, where the nightmare fits into the larger structure of reality. He believes he is in the right place. He believes the communion he sought is still possible, or perhaps that it has already occurred in some form he is still processing. He does not appear to be suffering exactly. This is perhaps the most disturbing thing about him. The people in the research hall are suffering, visibly, audibly, in every gesture. The Yharnam prisoners are suffering. Even the winter lanterns, if they experience anything at all, exist in a state that seems incompatible with anything like well-being. But Micolash seems, insofar as you can read the emotional state of a man in an iron cage who is primarily focused on running away from you, almost content. He is in the place his ideas led him. He is doing, or continuing to attempt to do, the thing he devoted his life to. The cost that was paid, his mind, his colleagues, the people of Yharnam, the entire apparatus of harm that the School of Mensis erected in service of its ritual, is a cost he does not appear to be registering. When you corner him eventually in a room with no exits, and the fight begins in earnest, he fights with genuine ability. He is not helpless. He is not the academic innocent his running might suggest. He calls down the power of the Great Ones with the facility that suggests he has been doing this for a long time and has gotten good at it. When you kill him, he says, with what sounds almost like acceptance, that the nightmare is drawing to a close. He does not sound afraid, he sounds mildly disappointed, as though he had hoped for more time, as though the conversation was just getting interesting. What Micolash represents in Bloodborne's world is the fullest expression of a specific and recognizable human failure. The failure of a genuinely intelligent person who has become so thoroughly convinced of the importance of their own ideas that the harm those ideas cause has stopped being fully real to them. He is not malicious. He never was malicious. He simply wanted to know, and wanted it with such totality that everything else, the school's victims, the school's cost, the people whose lives were consumed in service of the ritual, became, in his accounting, smaller than the knowing. He is not a villain. He is something more sobering than a villain. He is a man who loved an idea more than he loved the people it cost. There is a village at the edge of the world. You reach it through the hunter's nightmare, through the warped, fog-wrapped version of Yharnam that traps hunters who have gone too far, past the lighthouse hound and the river of blood and the mounted hunter on the hill. The village sits beneath a sky that is perpetually grey, above a sea that has the quality of something very old and very cold, and the buildings have the look of a place that was built to face the ocean and has been doing so for a very long time. The people who lived there were fishermen. This is the first and most important thing to understand about them. They were not Yharnamites. They had no connection to the healing church and no relationship with blood ministration, and no stake in the great institutional project that Byrgenwerth had begun and Lawrence had completed. They lived beside the water, fished it, built their community around it, and maintained their own relationship with whatever they considered sacred. A relationship that had nothing to do with the Great Ones in the academic sense that the scholars of Byrgenwerth understood the term, but which had, nonetheless, brought them into proximity with something. The something was Kos. Kos is a Great One unlike any other encountered in the game. She is not the moon presence, not the abstracted, impossible form of a being so vast it has no stable shape. She is not Mergo, not the ambiguous remnant of something that never fully existed. She is present on the shore, or her body is present vast and pale and motionless, washed up from whatever depth she had inhabited, resting in the shallows with the patient stillness of something that has finished moving. She appeared to be dead. The healing church scholars who found her, who reached the fishing hamlet through routes that the game implies involved considerable effort and deliberate concealment, assessed her as dead or close enough to dead that the distinction did not matter for their purposes, and their purposes were immediate and practical and not complicated by any of the considerations that might have given a different kind of people pause. They began to harvest her. The things recovered from Kos were extraordinary. Her eyes, the eyes of a Great One, physical objects in some sense that the game never fully resolves but treats as real enough to be taken and used, were exactly what the choir had been searching for. The Kos parasite, a living remnant of her being that would later become a weapon of sorts in the right hands. Her blood, which carried within it the concentrated essence of a Great One's nature, in quantities and purity that the diluted old blood of the Thumerian ruins could not approach. everything the Squire needed to advance the eye-grafting program beyond what they had been able to achieve with their existing resources. They took it all, and they did not stop with Kos. The fishermen themselves were harvested. Their proximity to a grate, one over generations, had changed them, physically, perceptibly, in ways that the choir's researchers recognized immediately as valuable. The parasites that lived within the fishermen's bodies, the physical traces of their long cohabitation with something cosmic, were exactly the kind of material the research hall needed for its grafting experiments. The church did not merely take Kos. It took the fishermen's bodies and their blood, and the biological record of their generations-long relationship with a being they had considered sacred. The snail women that populate the fishing hamlet in the hunter's nightmare, the pale, bent, slow-moving figures that cluster in the village's passages, are understood in many readings of the lore to be what remains of the village's women after the church's experiments. Changed by whatever was done to them, transformed into something that no longer maps cleanly onto the word human, but that retains in its posture and its movement and its apparent attachment to the village some residue of the people they were. They are not aggressive by nature, they are defensive. They are protecting the space they lived in, the only space they have, with the resources available to things that have been reduced to what they currently are. The fisherman watched. The fisherman had lived beside Kos, or beside her body, or beside whatever state she was in, long enough to have developed a relationship with her. Not the scholarly relationship of Byrgenwerth, not the institutional relationship of the healing church, but the kind of relationship that develops when a community lives in proximity to something enormous and strange over a long period of time. They considered her sacred. Her presence was woven into their understanding of the world, into whatever traditions and practices had grown up around the shore where she rested. The healing church's arrival, with its instruments and its certainty and its complete indifference to the question of whether any of this was sanctioned by anyone other than itself, was not ambiguous to them. They had seen it happen. They understood what had been done. They were witnesses. The church made a decision. It was not, by that point, a difficult decision for the kind of institution the healing church had become. Witnesses were a problem. Witnesses meant the possibility of knowledge reaching people who had not been told the official version of events, the possibility of questions being asked that the church had no good answers to, the possibility that the careful architecture of concealment that surrounded everything the church's upper levels actually did might develop a crack through which something true might escape. The solution was the same solution that had been applied to every other problem of this kind. They killed them. Every person in the fishing hamlet, every man, every woman, every child, every person who had stood on that shore and watched what was done to Kos, was murdered. The village was sealed, the access routes were hidden, and what had happened there was buried under the same institutional silence that covered the research hall and the Yahargul operations and everything else the church had decided the world did not need to know. There is a moment in the Old Hunters DLC, if you are paying attention, where you can find the body of a fishing hamlet villager in the Hunter's Nightmare, one of the pale, strange figures that populates the area's coast. And if you know what you are looking at, if you have followed the lore to this point, there is a quality to their presence in the nightmare that is different from the hunters who are trapped there by their own violence. The hunters are in the nightmare because of what they did. The villagers are in the nightmare because of what was done to them. Kos heard it. This is Bloodborne's most extraordinary claim, that a great one, dead or dreaming on a shore at the edge of the world, heard the massacre carried out in the proximity of her body. That whatever state she existed in was not so far removed from awareness, that the deaths of the people who had lived beside her passed unregistered, that she responded. The hunter's nightmare is that response. The entire nightmare space, the warped Yharnam, the river of blood, the giants and the hunters, and the terrible repetition of it all, is understood by many readings of the lore as Kos's curse, a space in which the hunters who participated in what happened at the fishing hamlet, and the hunters who came after them who participated in the same logic of violence and extraction and concealment, are held, bound to a repetition that has no end, unable to rest, unable to move on, unable to forget. The orphan of Kos is the last piece of this. He is the child of Kos, present in her body when the harvesting occurred, born into the nightmare from her corpse, clutching the remains of the placenta that should have been his first home. He emerges from her body screaming, and the scream has a quality that is different from the screams of other bosses. Not the scream of a beast, not the scream of a transformed human, but the scream of something that has just arrived in a world that has already committed a violence against it, and has no language yet for what it is feeling. He is a child, literally, developmentally, in every sense the game implies. He is an infant, born seconds ago from a mother who cannot help him, into a nightmare constructed around her death. The weapon he carries is the placenta, hardened. His attacks have the chaotic, uncontrolled energy of something that does not yet know how to direct what it is feeling. His cries, throughout the fight between attacks in the pauses when he rears back and screams at the sky, have been described by many players as the most genuinely distressing sound in the game. He does not understand what happened. He only knows that something is wrong, that the world he's arrived in is wrong, that the thing he was attached to, the presence that was supposed to be the first stable thing in his existence, is gone in a way that he has no framework to process, and he screams. When you kill him, the nightmare begins to end. His death releases something, some tension at the centre of the curse, some weight that has been holding the nightmare in its shape. The fisherman can rest, the hunters perhaps can rest. But the orphan, in his last moments, is still a child who died in a nightmare without ever understanding why. There is no version of this that is not devastating. You have played through the night. You have moved through the streets of Yharnam, and the halls of the healing church, and the forbidden woods, and the nightmare of Mensis, and the hunter's nightmare. You have found in each of these places the evidence of what was done, and by whom, and at what cost to whom. You have accumulated, without perhaps fully processing it, the full weight of what Yharnam is, and how it came to be what it is. And now Gehrman is waiting for you in the garden, and there is a choice to be made, or the appearance of a choice. In the first ending you accept Gehrman's offer. He explains with the gentleness of someone who has been waiting to have this conversation for a very long time, that the night is over and it is time to go, that the hunt has run its course, that there is a dawn coming and you can meet it, and whatever follows the meeting, whatever it means to die in the hunter's dream at the hands of the man who built it, is at least an ending, at least. Morning? He kills you in the garden. The camera rises. Yharnam is below, in the grey light of a dawn that has finally arrived, and the child on the hilltop looks up at a butterfly and the screen fades. It is, by the standards of Bloodborne, almost kind. Not because death is kind, but because the alternative, the other endings, the other shapes the night can take, are in many ways more disturbing than dying in a garden at dawn. The first ending has the quality of a door closing cleanly, of something that had a beginning and a middle being permitted at last to have an end. The hunter came to Yharnam seeking cure and found something else entirely, and now the night is over and there is a morning, and the cost of the night is paid in the simplest and most final way available. But look at it from Gehrman's perspective for a moment. He has done this before. That is the thing that makes the first ending land the way it does. The weariness in his voice, the precision of the movement when he rises from the wheelchair and draws his blade, the sense that this is a conversation he has rehearsed so many times that it has worn grooves into whatever remains of his personality. He is not killing you because he wants to. He is killing you because this is his function. This is what the moon presence built the dream around him to do. Welcome the hunter, guide the hunter, and when the night is finished, release the hunter so that the dream can reset and the cycle can continue, and the next hunter can arrive and the next hunt can begin. Gehrman is the wet nurse, in a different shape. A guardian assigned to a function, stripped of everything that does not serve that function, over the course of a repetition so long that time itself has stopped being a meaningful framework for understanding it. He tends the dream the way the wet nurse tends Mergo, not because he chose to, not because he understands why, but because the thing that placed him here did not build in a mechanism for stopping. In the second ending you refuse. You refuse Gehrman's offer, which is also a refusal of everything he represents. The acceptance of limitation, the acknowledgement of what the hunt costs, the willingness to be finished. You fight him in the garden, and if you win, if you kill the first hunter, the man who built the workshop and the dream and the entire apparatus of the hunt, the moon presence descends. The moon presence is the great one whose influence underlies the hunter's dream. She descends from the sky like a thought becoming physical, and she attempts to claim you, to do to you what was done to Gehrman, to make you the new prisoner of the dream, the new hands holding the chain, the new person who wakes the hunters and watches the nightmare cycle and waits. And if you do not have the umbilical cords, she succeeds. This is the second ending, the one in which you become the new Gehrman. The camera lingers on your figure in the wheelchair, in the garden, in the grey light of the dream, and the doll approaches and kneels and says that she will be there for you, and the screen fades not to a morning, but to the beginning of another night. The horror of the second ending is not what happens to you. It is what will continue to happen through you. Every future hunter who enters the dream will be welcomed by the thing you have become. Every future hunt will be guided by hands that used to be yours. And at the end of every future night, you will sit in the garden and make the same offer that Gehrman made to you. And some hunters will accept and some will refuse, and the ones who refuse will face you, and if they win, the moon presence will descend again, and the cycle will continue. You have not broken the system. You have become part of it. You have joined the machinery of the dream the way Lawrence joined the machinery of the church, with whatever intentions you had, whatever reasons you had for refusing, whatever you believed refusing meant. none of it matters. The system absorbed you. It absorbed Gehrman, and it will absorb whoever comes after you because the system does not require your consent. It only requires your presence. If you have consumed 3 umbilical cords, something different happens. The transformation that the moon presence intends, the one that would bind you to the dream, is interrupted by what the cords have done to you. Your humanity, or whatever quality the cords represent, is sufficient to resist the binding. What happens instead is not a binding, but a becoming. You become something else. The game does not show this in full, it shows the beginning of it. The body curling, the scale shifting, the world reorganizing itself around a new center, and then it cuts to the doll, cradling what you have become with the tenderness that suggests she has been waiting for this, that this was always the other possible outcome, the one she hoped for. What remains of you is small and pale and strange, and it is not the hunter who walked into Yharnam at the beginning of the night, and whether it is still in any meaningful sense, you is a question the game leaves open. You are an infant great one. The implication is clear even if the game never states it in those terms. You have undergone the transformation that Willem dreamed of, that Lawrence built an entire church around the possibility of, that the choir and the school of Mensis and every scholar and every institution in Bloodborne's world was reaching toward with varying degrees of desperation. You have ascended. But what does ascension mean in the world Bloodborne has shown you? It means becoming one of the things that the entire story has been about. Becoming a great one. One of the vast, lonely, incomprehensible presences that reach toward humanity with a need that the word need cannot quite capture, and that produces each time it expresses itself the kind of devastation that Yharnam has experienced. You have achieved the goal, you have crossed the threshold, and on the other side of the threshold is a different kind of isolation, a different kind of duration, and the same pattern of reaching towards something that cannot withstand the reaching. What all 3 endings share is the absence of the obvious alternative. There is no ending in which you simply leave, no ending in which you wake up in a bed somewhere outside Yharnam and reconstruct whatever life you had before the night began. No ending in which the cost is acknowledged and refunded, in which the things you paid are returned to you with interest. The best you can do is choose the shape of your transformation. Choose whether you will die at dawn, or be bound to the dream, or become something that the game has no name for. Bloodborne as a game about a city that consumed its people in service of an idea, and its endings suggest, with a quiet that is almost gentle, that the hunt consumes the people who perform it in the same way, that there is no position in this system from which you emerge unchanged, that the night, however you survive it, takes something. We have been moving around the edges of this question for the entire night, and it is time to look at it directly. What are the Great Ones? The game resists easy answers to this with a consistency that is clearly deliberate. It would have been possible in the construction of Bloodborne's world to make the Great Ones legible, to give them motivations that translate cleanly into human terms, to build them as gods or demons or alien intelligences with comprehensible agendas. The game does not do this. The Great Ones remain throughout at the edge of understanding, visible enough to be real and present in the world, obscure enough that every explanation of them is at best partial. What the game does give us is a set of consistent implications. The Great Ones are not malevolent. This is the first and most important thing to establish, because it runs counter to the intuition that everything terrible in Bloodborne's world is the Great One's fault, the Beast Plague, the transformed citizens, the massacres and experiments and institutional cruelties. None of this is the Great One's doing in any direct or intentional sense. The Great Ones did not instruct Lawrence to found the Healing Church. They did not order the choir to conduct the research hall experiments. They did not tell the School of Mensis to build the ritual that destroyed their members' minds. All of that was human ambition and human cruelty and human institutions running past the point where any individual within them could have stopped them. The Great Ones are simply present. They exist in the world of Bloodborne the way deep geological formations exist, as forces and structures that predate human consciousness and operate on scales, and according to principles that human consciousness is not equipped to fully perceive. They are not gods, despite the word being used in proximity to them throughout the game. Gods, in the sense that most traditions use the word, are beings that care about humanity in some way, that judge it, or love it, or want something from it that maps onto wanting in the human sense. The Great Ones want something, but the nature of that wanting is not like human wanting. They want children. This is the thread that runs through everything, through Mergo and the orphan of Kos and Arianna in her corner, and Udin's presence in the blood. The Great Ones are, at some level, lonely in a way that the word lonely cannot quite capture. Alone in a universe that they perceive fully and that nothing else perceives in the same way. Looking for something that can perceive it alongside them. Not worship, not submission, not the relationship between a god and its devotees. Something more intimate than that, and more equal and more impossible. Consider them one at a time. Whedon is formless, a great one without a body, distributed through the blood and the air and the stone of Yharnam like a thought that has no thinker. He moves through the medium of blood itself, which is why the blood is so central to everything, and why blood ministration, which the Healing Church presented as a medical procedure, was in some sense always a form of communion with something that the patients were never told was present. Eden's desire for a child expressed itself through Arianna, through whatever confluence of blood lineage and proximity, and the formless reaching of a consciousness that has no hands brought the two of them into contact. He did not choose her in the way a human chooses. He simply moved through the blood, and the blood was everywhere, and Arianna's blood was closer to what he needed than most. The moon presence is a great one who built something. The hunter's dream, the apparatus of the hunt, the entire structure that you move through for the duration of the game. She built it around Gehrman the way someone builds a house around a hearth. She needed a centre for the dream, a consciousness to anchor it, and Gehrman served that function the way the wet nurse serves hers, not by choice, not with full understanding, but because the moon presence's need was larger than his capacity to refuse it. What she wants from the dream, what purpose the hunt serves in her economy, is one of the game's genuinely open questions, but the pattern is the same. A great one, reaching, a human, caught in the reaching, a structure built around the contact that serves the Great One's purposes and consumes the human's life. Kos, on her shore, was different. Kos had found something that the other Great Ones had not, a community that existed in proximity to her without being destroyed by that proximity. The fishermen of the fishing hamlet lived beside her and were changed by her presence. Certainly, their appearance, their customs, the parasites that the choir later harvested from their bodies, all suggest that Koss's influence had reshaped them over generations. But they were still alive, still functional, still a community with relationships and traditions and the ordinary architecture of human social life. Whatever Koss was doing to them, or whatever they were doing with Koss, it had reached something like an equilibrium, a balance between the cosmic and the human that was, in the context of Bloodborne's world, unprecedented. The Healing Church destroyed that equilibrium in an afternoon. This is perhaps the most damning detail in the entire game. The one example in Bloodborne's world of a relationship between humans and a Great One that was not destroying the humans. The one proof of concept that coexistence was possible, that the gap could be navigated without annihilation, was dismantled by the same institution that claimed to be pursuing exactly that relationship. The choir wanted communion with the Great Ones. The fisherman had communion with a Great One, and the choir, rather than studying the communion, rather than learning from the only people in the world who had achieved what the church said it wanted, treated them as material, harvested the Great One, harvested the people, destroyed the village, buried the evidence. The institution could not recognize the thing it was looking for because the thing it was looking for did not look the way the institution expected. It looked like a fishing village on a grey shore. It looked like ordinary people living ordinary lives in proximity to something extraordinary. It did not look like research. It did not look like progress. It did not look like the kind of achievement that an institution could claim credit for. So the institution destroyed it and took what it could carry back to the research hall, where it was pressed into the skulls of patients who had not been asked whether they wanted eyes on the inside, and the fishing hamlet was sealed, and the fishermen were silenced, and the choir wrote its notes about progress. They want children in the way that anything vast and isolated wants connection with a need that is not strategic or malicious or even fully conscious, but simply present, woven into their nature the way hunger is woven into the nature of living things, and the children they can have with humans, the Mergos of the world, the things that Arianna bore in the corner of the chapel, are attempts at that connection, attempts at producing something that partakes of both natures, that can exist in the space between the human and the Great One, that can be the thing neither can be alone. Every one of these children fails. Mergo is stillborn. The orphan of Koss is born into a nightmare from a dead mother. Arianna's child is a pale, writhing thing on a chapel floor. The third ending's infant Great One, the thing you become, is cradled by a doll in a dream that is dissolving. None of these children are whole. None of them are the bridge between natures that the Great Ones seem to be reaching toward. They are attempts, sincere perhaps, in whatever way sincerity applies to beings of this scale, that fail because the gap between the human and the cosmic is not a gap that can be bridged by reproduction. It is a gap that exists in the nature of things, and every attempt to cross it produces not a bridge but a wound. The tragedy is that the connection the Great Ones seek and the connection that human beings can survive are not the same thing. Every attempt at communion, on every scale, ends in transformation or annihilation, not because the Great Ones intend harm. They do not intend anything in the way that humans intend things, but because the scale of what they are is so incompatible with the scale of what we are, that the contact itself is the damage. A great one reaching toward humanity is like a tide reaching toward a sandcastle, not trying to destroy it, not aware that destruction is an option, simply moving according to its nature and finding, each time, that the thing it reaches for cannot withstand the reaching. Yharnam understood this, eventually. Or rather, Yharnam would have understood it if there had been anyone left in the city's power structure who was willing to look at what the evidence showed and draw the conclusion it pointed toward. But by the time the evidence was fully assembled, the institution was too large and too embedded and too committed to its own continuation to absorb the conclusion. So the tide came in, and Yharnam went the way that sandcastles go. We have spent the night in Yharnam. We have been through its institutions and its crimes, its scholars and its victims, its gods and the wreckage they left behind simply by existing. We have followed the blood from Byrgenwerth to the healing church, to the research hall, to the fishing hamlet, to the Nightmare of Mensis, and we have seen, at each stop, the same pattern, reproduced in a different key. An institution, a goal that, in isolation, was not contemptible, understanding consciousness, healing the sick, making contact with a higher order of being. A process of pursuing that goal that required the use of people who had not agreed to be used. A decision made somewhere in the upper reaches of the institution where the full picture was visible, that the goal was worth the cost. And then the cost, paid by people who were never consulted, never informed, never given the option of declining. Bloodborne is not an anti-intellectual story. It is not saying that curiosity is wrong, or that the pursuit of knowledge leads inevitably to corruption, or that Willem and Lawrence and the choir and Micolash were simply evil people doing evil things. The game is too precise for that kind of argument, too careful about the texture of its characters and their motivations to reduce them to simple villainy. What it is saying is something more specific and more uncomfortable. It is saying that the most dangerous thing in human intellectual and institutional life is not ignorance. It is the moment when an institution's commitment to its own goals becomes stronger than its commitment to the people its goals affect. The moment when the research program or the church or the college becomes more important than the patients, the citizens, the pilgrims who trusted it. The moment when the people at the top look at what they know, and they know, in every case in Bloodborne they know, and decide that continuing is preferable to admitting what continuing costs. The healing church knew what the blood was doing to Yharnam. The church continued. The choir knew what the research hall was doing to its patients. The choir continued. The school of Mensis knew that their ritual was consuming their colleagues' minds. The school continued. In each case, the decision to continue was not made by monsters. It was made by people who had invested too much in the idea to be able to see it clearly anymore, who had organized their entire sense of purpose and meaning and identity around the pursuit, and who had, in consequence, lost the capacity to weigh the pursuit against what it cost. This is the horror that Bloodborne is really about. Not the Great Ones, not the Beast Plague, not the winter lanterns drifting through the fog, or the orphan of Kos screaming at the sky, or Mergo crying in the darkness of the nightmare. Those are the consequences. They are the end result of the same process, run to its conclusion on a cosmic scale. The horror is the meeting that happened somewhere in the upper floors of the Grand Cathedral, at which someone looked at the evidence of what the blood was doing to the city and decided that the institution was worth more than the city. The horror is that no record of that meeting survives, that no one involved felt the need to justify it, because by the time it happened the decision had already been made so many times on so many smaller scales that it had stopped feeling like a decision at all. It had become simply what institutions do. Yharnam is not a cautionary tale about reaching too far. It is not a warning about the dangers of forbidden knowledge or the punishment that follows hubris. It is something more grounded and more contemporary and more difficult to dismiss than that. It is a portrait of institutional failure, of what happens when the people with the most information and the most power use that information, and power to protect the institution rather than the people the institution was built to serve. It is a portrait of Byrgenwerth and the Healing Church and the choir and the School of Mensis. It is, if you're willing to look at it directly, a portrait of things that exist in the world outside the game as well. This is why Bloodborne does not have a happy ending. Not because the developers wanted to be bleak for its own sake, not because the Souls-like genre demands suffering as a matter of aesthetic principle, but because the story it is telling is one that does not have a happy ending in the world it is depicting. The rot went too deep too early. The institutions that could have changed course chose not to. The people who understood what was happening, Maria perhaps in her way, the fishermen who watched and were silenced, were not the people with the power to stop it. What remains is the nightmare, and the hunter, moving through the nightmare trying to understand what happened. The bells of Yharnam have stopped ringing. The streets are quiet in the way that streets are quiet when there is no one left to walk them. Not the quiet of a city at rest, not the comfortable silence of a place that has closed its eyes for the night, but the quiet of a place that has finished. The blood has dried on the cobblestones. The fires have gone cold. The last hunter has made their choice in the garden at dawn, and whatever that choice has led to it now, and the dream is dissolving at its edges like fog when the morning finally comes in earnest. What Bloodborne leaves you with is not despair exactly. It is something more precise than despair, and in some ways harder to live with. Despair has a completeness to it, a kind of closure. This is terrible and there is nothing to be done, and that is the end of the sentence. What Bloodborne leaves you with is not that. It is the feeling of having understood something that you would perhaps have preferred not to understand, but that you cannot now ununderstand. That the world is full of institutions, that institutions are built by people with genuine intentions, that genuine intentions are not sufficient protection against the slow, cumulative, entirely ordinary process by which an institution's commitment to its own continuation comes to outweigh its commitment to the people it was built to serve. That this process does not require villains, does not require anyone to make a decision they experience as villainous. It requires only the ordinary human capacity for rationalization, the ordinary institutional tendency to protect the structure, the ordinary gap between what people at the top know and what the people affected by their decisions are told. Yharnam fell because of that gap, not because of the Great Ones, not because of the Beast Plague, not because of the cosmic forces that moved through the city like tides. Those were the proximate causes, the visible mechanisms of the destruction. But the gap was there before the blood arrived, built into the architecture of Byrgenwerth from the moment Willem decided that the pursuit was worth the cost. And everything that followed, the church, the choir, the school of Mensis, the fishing Hamlet, all of it was the gap made larger, made institutional, made permanent. There is a version of this story that ends differently. There is a world in which Willem, encountering the evidence of what his experiments were doing to his students, stopped, in which Lawrence, understanding what the blood would eventually do to the city, told the truth, in which the choir, looking at the patients in the research hall, decided that whatever the communion with the Great Ones offered, it was not worth this. None of those people made those choices. The story we have does not contain them. What it contains instead is Yharnam, the city as it is, the nightmare as it persists, the infant crying in the dark, the hunter standing in the garden, the bells that rang for so long that no one alive remembered why, and somewhere, in the deep places beneath the city, Master Willem in his chair at the edge of the lake, still running the calculations, still certain the direction is right. One last thing before the night ends completely. There is a detail in Bloodborne that most players walk past without registering, and it has stayed with me longer than any of the horrors we have discussed tonight. The doll in the hunter's dream will sometimes speak to you unprompted. If you approach her at certain points in the game, she will say things that do not quite fit the role the dream has assigned her, things that suggest a consciousness operating underneath the function, a presence that is thinking about the situation it finds itself in with more clarity than the system that created it intended. She says, at one point, that she thinks the hunters she tends to must have a longing of some sort, that the purpose of the dream, and of her existence within it, must relate to that longing, that the system was built to house something, and the something is not the hunt itself but the need that drives people to enter it. She does not say this with certainty. She says it the way someone says a thought they have been turning over for a long time and have not yet finished with. She is, in some readings of the game, the most perceptive character in it. Not because she has access to information the other characters lack. The choir had more information. The school of Mensis had more. Even Willem in his silence had more. But because she is the only figure in the game who looks at the system she is part of and asks what it is for, not what it does. Everyone in Bloodborne can see what the system does. The evidence is in the streets and the nightmares and the bodies fused into the walls of Yharnam. But what it is for, what need it serves, what the longing is that built it. The Great Ones long for children. The scholars long for knowledge. The church longs for power, or for the continuation that power makes possible. The hunters long for the hunt, or for the meaning the hunt gives them, or for the morning that the hunt promises will come if they just keep going a little longer. Everyone in Bloodborne is longing for something, and the longing is what the system runs on. It is the fuel. Remove the longing and the entire apparatus. The church, the dream, the nightmares, the hunt itself has no engine. It simply stops. The doll sees this. She sees it, and she does not judge it, and she does not try to fix it. She simply names it, quietly, to a hunter who may or may not be listening, in a dream that may or may not continue to exist after the night is over. It is the closest thing Bloodborne has to wisdom. Not the pursuit of eyes on the inside, not the communion with the Great Ones, not the transcendence that every institution in the game was reaching toward with such desperate and destructive certainty. Just the observation, made by a being who was created to serve a function, and who somehow developed the capacity to see past it, that the entire structure rests on a longing, and that the longing is real, even if everything built on top of it is monstrous. The night is over now. The fog is lifting from whatever city you are in, or the darkness is settling more deeply around you, depending on where in the world you are listening. Either way, the hunt is finished. The law has been laid out. Not all of it, because Bloodborne's law cannot be fully laid out, because the game was built to resist that kind of completeness, to always have one more corridor you have not walked down, and one more item description you have not read, and one more implication you have not followed to its conclusion. But enough to understand what Yharnam was, and what built it, and what destroyed it, and why the destruction was not an accident but a consequence of decisions that were made by people who knew what they were doing and did it anyway. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this is the kind of thing that helps you drift off, that gives your mind something to hold on to as the day releases its grip, then there is more of it here. Subscribe if you have not. The next video is already in progress, and the lore runs deep, and the nights are long, and there is no shortage of stories that deserve to be told this way. The doll will be here when you return. She always is. Good night.